When we think of the collapse of the Third Reich, we picture the ruins of Berlin and the final days in the bunker. By 1945, Allied intelligence believed they had catalogued every terror weapon in the Nazi arsenal: the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the desperate last-ditch efforts. But in April 1945, when American soldiers kicked open the doors of a hidden hangar in Friedrichsroda, they realized the inventory was incomplete. Inside, covered in dust and camouflage, was an object that defied the physics of 1940s aviation. It wasn't a tank or a standard fighter. It was a phantom. It had no tail. It had no fuselage. It was a sleek, bat-like silhouette that looked like it had fallen from the future. Built from plywood and glue to save resources, and it utilized aerodynamic concepts that wouldn't be fully realized until the American B-2 Spirit bomber nearly 40 years later. This was the Ho 229, a weapon designed to be invisible. But before we declassify the engineering secrets of this ghost plane, I have a question for you. Historians remain divided on whether this technology was too little, too late, or a missed opportunity that could have saved the Reich. Pause the video right now and type "game changer" in the comments if you think this weapon could have turned the war around, or "too late" if you think Germany was already doomed. I want to see your vote on history's most terrifying "what if." The story starts in the 1920s with two brothers, Walter and Reimar Horten, who were obsessed with an idea everyone else thought was impossible. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was banned from building military aircraft engines, but the treaty said nothing about gravity. While the rest of the country flew standard gliders, the brothers noticed a fundamental flaw in aviation design. Every plane in the sky had a fuselage, a tail, and fins. To the Hortens, these weren't necessary parts. They were parasites. They created drag and wasted energy. They asked a radical question. What if you deleted the plane and kept only the wing? To understand the machine found in that hangar, we must step back from the fires of 1945 to a Germany that had been grounded. Walter and Reimar Horten grew up in the shadow of the Great War, coming of age in the 1920s, a time when the nation was strictly forbidden from possessing military aircraft. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the country of its air force, making the production of powered warplanes illegal. The victors intended to keep the skies empty of German steel, but the treaty contained a loophole. The document banned engines, but it said nothing about gravity, and it said nothing about gliders. As a result, a fervor for unpowered flight swept across the country, with gliding becoming hugely popular as a way to circumvent the restrictions. While the rest of the world burned fuel, German aviators learned to read the wind. The Horten brothers were no exception. They spent their weekends on the hillsides constructing and launching simple wooden aircraft. But while most enthusiasts were content to simply enjoy the hobby, the brothers began to analyze the machines with a critical engineering eye. They observed a stagnation in aviation. Every airplane in the world, from the smallest glider to the largest transport, utilized the exact same fundamental architecture. They all featured a long, cigar-shaped fuselage in the middle, wings bolted to the sides, a tail assembly in the back, and vertical fins sticking up into the airstream. To the Horten brothers, this standard design was inefficient. They realized that all those extra parts, the fuselage, the tail, the stabilizers, were aerodynamic parasites. They created resistance against the air, dragging the aircraft back. In powered flight, this drag created a vicious cycle. More resistance required bigger, heavier engines, which in turn demanded more fuel just to keep the machine airborne. The brothers believed the entire industry was solving the wrong problem. Instead of adding more power to overcome drag, they wanted to eliminate the drag entirely. The Hortens proposed a radical deviation from 80 years of aviation theory. They asked a simple, dangerous question. What if you got rid of everything except the wing itself? Their concept was absolute minimalism. There would be no separate body to hold the pilot, no tail to stabilize the pitch, and no vertical fins to control the yaw. It would be just one massive curved wing capable of generating lift, steering itself, and carrying the payload inside the wing structure. It sounds simple in theory, but in the 1930s, no one had ever successfully applied this to a functional, stable airplane. Without a tail, a plane is naturally unstable. If it stalls, it spins, and if it spins, it crashes. Undeterred, the brothers started small. They turned their parents' garage into a workshop, fabricating their first radical designs using cheap plywood and glue. When they hauled these strange bat-like models to the testing grounds, the results were undeniable. These odd-looking designs flew smoother and stayed in the air longer than traditional planes. By removing the friction of the fuselage and tail, they had unlocked a level of efficiency that conventional engineering said was impossible. But proving a concept with a wooden glider was one thing. The real problem was turning a backyard experiment into an actual war machine. By 1943, the illusion of German invincibility had shattered. The situation on the ground was catastrophic. British and American bombers were wiping out German cities night after night, reducing factories to ash and crippling the industrial machine. The Luftwaffe, once the ruler of the skies, was running out of planes and running out of pilots. Desperate to regain air superiority, Hermann Göring, the head of the German Air Force, demanded a miracle weapon. He issued a challenge to every major aircraft manufacturer in Germany, a directive known as Project 3x1000. The requirements were simple on paper but technologically impossible in practice. Göring demanded a plane capable of carrying 1,000 kilograms of bombs, flying a distance of 1,000 kilometers, and reaching a speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour. To the established engineers at aviation giants like Messerschmitt and Junkers, this demand was proof that Göring had completely lost touch with reality. In 1943, the numbers simply did not make sense. The fastest piston-engine fighter planes in existence barely reached 700 kilometers per hour, and that was only when diving straight down. Heavy bombers, which carried the required payload, lumbered through the sky at speeds closer to 400 kilometers per hour. The industry hit a technological wall. Regular piston engines could not generate enough power to reach 1,000 kilometers per hour, no matter how hard they were pushed. The alternative was the newly developed jet engine, which offered raw speed, but it came with a fatal flaw. Early jet engines were inefficient. They gulped fuel so rapidly that any plane using them would run dry long before it reached the 1,000-kilometer target. The mathematics of the era dictated that you could have a fast plane with a short range or a slow plane with a long range. You could not have both. Engineers dismissed the project, convinced that the math just didn't work. Except for the Horten brothers. While the major manufacturers tried to force more power into traditional airframes, Walter and Reimar looked at the problem differently. They saw an answer nobody else could see. They realized that the problem wasn't the engine. It was the plane itself. Their flying wing design generated significantly less air resistance than a standard aircraft. Less resistance meant the plane didn't have to fight the air, which meant it burned less fuel at high speeds. The brothers calculated that by eliminating the tail and fuselage, they could offset the fuel consumption of the jet engines. The flying wing was the only design in existence that might actually hit all three numbers Göring wanted. While the rest of the German aviation industry scoffed at the impossible demand, the Horten brothers began drawing up the plans for the Ho 229. The Horten brothers drew up the plans for the Ho 229 and submitted them directly to the High Command. In a military structure defined by rigid tradition and paralyzed by bureaucracy, a design this radical should have been rejected immediately. The aircraft lacked a fuselage, lacked a tail, and relied on unproven aerodynamics. But when Hermann Göring saw the designs, he did not laugh, and he did not throw them away. Göring, desperate for a solution to the crumbling air defense, saw the mathematical potential that others had missed. He realized that this strange wooden wing was the only platform capable of meeting the impossible 3 times 1,000 requirements. Consequently, he made a decision that would bypass the entire German industrial chain of command. He granted Walter and Reimar Horten unlimited funding and top priority on everything they required. This directive acted as a blank check in an economy that was effectively bankrupt. Suddenly, 2 brothers who had been building models in a garage were given the power to commandeer resources from the most established military projects in the Reich. They were authorized to hire the best engineers available and procure scarce materials without anyone questioning their decisions. The result was an industrial anomaly. While British and American bombers were systematically dismantling German cities and setting factories ablaze night after night, a protected bubble of innovation formed around the Horten project. As the Luftwaffe ran out of standard planes and pilots, the Horten facility began to consume resources to build something that looked like it didn't belong in the 1940s. They began construction on a machine that would push German engineering into territory that would not exist again for another 40 years. With the full weight of the state behind them, they bent steel tubes and cut plywood sheets, racing to finish a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The crazy idea had become the highest priority of a dying empire. When American soldiers captured the Ho 229 and their engineers finally looked at it closely, the initial reaction was not awe, but immediate confusion. These technical experts, accustomed to the riveted aluminum and heavy steel that defined every other warplane of the era, expected to find advanced alloys. Instead, they ran their hands over the skin of the aircraft and found plywood. The construction appeared bafflingly primitive for a supposed superweapon. The entire wing structure was composed of layers of thin wood glued together. Even the internal skeleton defied standard aviation practices. The frame consisted of steel tubes, but they were wrapped in wood. At first glance, the Allied assessment was dismissive. They assumed that the strategic bombing campaigns had successfully starved Germany of metal, forcing the Nazis to build their final jets out of desperation and scraps. While it was true that resources were scarce, the decision to build the plane out of wood was not a result of poverty. It was a result of calculation. Reimar Horten had spent years analyzing the failure of the Luftwaffe to penetrate British defenses. He knew exactly how British radar worked. The radar stations lining the English coast sent out powerful radio waves that traveled across the channel, bounced off the metal bodies of incoming aircraft, and returned to the station as dots on a screen. This reflection was the primary mechanism that allowed England to spot German bombers long before they arrived over their targets. Horten realized that the material of the plane itself was the liability. Metal acted as a mirror for radar waves. But wood did not bounce radio waves back the same way metal did. The waves largely passed through the wood instead of reflecting, naturally reducing the aircraft's visibility. However, the brothers went even further than simple material selection. They altered the chemistry of the aircraft itself by mixing coal dust and sawdust into the glue used between the wood layers. This specific mixture was not merely for structural bonding. Scientists who tested samples of this composite decades later discovered that the carbon in the coal dust soaked up radio waves. Instead of sending a signal back to the radar operator, the carbon converted the electromagnetic energy into tiny amounts of heat. The Ho 229 became the first real stealth aircraft ever built, designed from the ground up to slip past radar completely. In 2009, engineers finally tested this theory by subjecting a replica of the Ho 229 to 1940s-era radar simulations. The results confirmed the effectiveness of the design. The data showed that the aircraft would have been nearly invisible, appearing on the radar screens not as a massive bomber, but as just a small bird. But being invisible was only half the plan. While the engineering of the aircraft was a marvel of aerodynamics, the intent behind it was far darker. The true purpose of the HO 229 became clear only when American intelligence officers cracked open the safes at the captured facility and found a cache of secret documents. These papers revealed that the aircraft was not simply meant to be a fighter jet or a conventional bomber. The design specifications insisted on a payload capacity of exactly 1,000 kilograms. For historians and intelligence analysts, that specific number was the key that unlocked the mystery. It was not a random figure derived from fuel calculations, and it matched the precise weight of a specific weapon Nazi Germany was quietly developing in the shadows: a dirty bomb. By this stage of the war, Germany had failed to manufacture a functioning atomic bomb like the ones the United States would later drop on Japan. However, they possessed a terrifying alternative. Nazi scientists were developing a weapon that mixed conventional high explosives with the radioactive powder and waste left over from their nuclear reactor tests. The mechanics of this weapon were distinct from a nuclear blast. When a dirty bomb detonates, the explosion itself is not necessarily massive. Instead, the blast serves as a dispersion mechanism, scattering highly radioactive material across a wide radius. The tactical goal is not to level buildings with a shock wave, but to poison the ground itself. The radiation would render the target area unlivable for years, forcing a total evacuation and creating a zone of death that no army could cross and no civilian could inhabit. The Ho 229 was the perfect delivery system for such a weapon. Its speed and stealth capabilities meant that Allied radar stations would likely only detect it minutes before it arrived over the target. This would give air raid sirens almost no time to sound, and defenders almost no time to react. Documents found at the site listed specific targets for this radiological terror, including London and Allied army positions moving through Belgium. Yet, the ambition of the project extended beyond Europe. The intelligence officers found blueprints for a second, even larger iteration of the aircraft, known as the Ho-18. This design was a monster compared to the prototype in the hangar. It was 3 times bigger, powered by 6 jet engines, and designed with enough fuel capacity to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. The target list for the HO-18 included New York and Washington, D.C. The Nazis were not just building a plane to defend Germany. They were building a machine capable of delivering a radioactive payload to the steps of the White House. The plan was to bypass the Atlantic defenses entirely, strike the American homeland without warning, and leave its major cities poisoned and abandoned. The Ho-229 was not just a plane, it was the mechanism for a stolen future. By February 1945, time had run out. The Allied noose was tightening around Germany, and the Horten brothers knew that their window to prove the viability of the Ho-229 was closing. The theory was sound, the wind tunnel data was promising, but a war machine is not proven on paper. It is proven in the air. On February 18, 1945, test pilot Erwin Ziller climbed into the cockpit of the second prototype. This was the critical moment. The aircraft taxied onto the runway, its bat-like silhouette stark against the winter sky. Ziller throttled up the jet engines, and the wooden wing lifted off the ground, ascending into the air above the testing grounds. The aircraft climbed successfully, reaching an altitude of 800 meters. For a brief window, the radical design appeared to validate every claim the brothers had made. It was flying. But then, the fragility of the early jet age asserted itself. Suddenly, the right engine caught fire. In a conventional fighter aircraft, an engine failure is dangerous but survivable. A pilot can use the vertical stabilizer on the tail, the rudder, to counteract the uneven thrust and keep the plane flying straight while limping back to base. But the HO-229 had eliminated the tail to achieve its stealth and speed. Now, that aerodynamic purity became a death sentence. Ziller fought the controls. He tried everything to stabilize the aircraft and bring it down safely, but without a tail to help balance the asymmetric thrust of the single working engine, the physics of the situation were unforgiving. The aircraft could not maintain its heading. With only one engine pushing the wing, the plane violently twisted. It went into an uncontrollable spin, plummeting from the sky. The revolutionary wooden wing smashed into the earth and shattered. Erwin Ziller was killed, and the prototype was consumed by flames. The crash was a catastrophic blow. The wreckage burned, and with it, the immediate hope of mass production. There was no time to investigate the failure, no time to redesign, and no time to train a replacement. 3 weeks later, the war arrived at the factory gates. The crash at 800 meters had effectively grounded the program just long enough for history to intervene. 3 weeks after the smoke cleared from Ziller's fatal crash, the ground war arrived at the factory gates. American troops stormed into Friedrichsroda, securing the facility before it could be sabotaged. Inside the main hangar, they found the third Ho-229 prototype sitting in the shadows. It was nearly complete, a silent testament to the frantic final days of the Reich, but it had never flown. The soldiers on the ground realized immediately that this was not a standard prize of war. Instead of destroying the strange machine or melting it down for scrap, they initiated a careful operation to preserve it. They took the HO-229 apart, piece by piece, cataloging the wooden wings and the steel tube frame. They packed the components into crates and shipped the entire aircraft across the Atlantic to America. For the next several decades, the aircraft vanished from public view. It ended up hidden in a storage facility belonging to the Smithsonian, locked away in the dark as the world moved into the Cold War. But while the physical plane sat collecting dust, the ideas it contained were being resurrected. American engineers at companies like Northrop began to study the captured German blueprints with intense interest. They analyzed the math that Walter and Reimar Horten had developed in the 1930s, realizing that the brothers had been right all along. The flying wing concept was not a failure, it was the future. Northrop used these specific concepts to design the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The visual echo between the two machines is undeniable. The modern American bomber shares the same tailless, bat-like silhouette as the wooden prototype found in the German Hangar. The crazy idea that the German aviation industry had once mocked became the foundation of the most advanced air superiority platform on Earth. However, for years, historians and aerodynamicists debated whether the original German design was truly stealth, or if that was merely a myth born of post-war speculation. The answer finally came in 2009. A team of engineers and historians built a full-scale replica of the Ho-229 to settle the argument once and for all. They subjected the recreation to the exact radar frequencies used by the British during World War II. The results of the test vindicated the Horten brothers completely. The data showed that the wood-and-carbon design would have been nearly invisible to early radar networks. On the operator's screen, the massive bomber would not have shown up as an incoming aircraft. It would have appeared as a signal no larger than a small bird. The Nazis lost the war, and the Third Reich collapsed, but the technology they birthed lived on to shape everything that came after. The Ho-229 remained hidden, unfinished and forgotten, a ghost plane proving that the most dangerous weapon is often the one you never see coming. So, I'm turning the question back to you. Now that you know the true capabilities of this ghost plane, do you stand by your vote? Could a fleet of these stealth bombers have actually stopped the Allied advance, or was the war already lost? Scroll down and defend your answer in the comments. And if you enjoyed uncovering this secret history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we have another classified file opening next week.